Hello, history students. Um, let's talk about the Cold War. So, the Cold War is an interesting topic for a variety of reasons. I was born during the Cold War, and when I was a child, I remember like living through the Cold War. We were scared of Russians. Everybody thought there was Russian spies everywhere, which is crazy to think about now. But the Cold War was not a war per se. It did involve two wars, but in and of itself, the Cold War was not a war. It describes an era of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. So basically, this era is from 1945, although that's debatable. Some historians kind of put the beginning of the Cold War a little bit later, but I think I agree with the 1945 start point. The end of the Cold War is very clear. It was when the Soviet Union came down, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, which was complete in 1991. So we're looking at basically 1945 to 1991. I am actually going to go over the PowerPoint that is in this week's assignments. If you want to follow along, that would be great. Just open it in a different window. So first, the roots of the Cold War, like where did it come from? I'm not going to go over everything in this PowerPoint. I'm just going to kind of pick out some things that are super significant or that might not be covered as much in the reading assignments as others. So I want to kind of start with World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, as you know, were allies during World War II. Towards the end of the war, there was mutual distrust building on both sides. One thing that's really interesting is that the Manhattan Project, where the United States was developing the world's first atomic bomb, that was kept secret from the Soviets. It was even kept secret from the vice president, Harry Truman, which is crazy. Only a few people knew about it. Winston Churchill of England was involved, but the Soviet leader was not told, and he was one of the allies. So this indicated that there was already some distrust. And the thing that happened is that the Soviet Union had a spy working on the Manhattan Project. And so he was reporting back to the Soviets, to Stalin, that we were building this bomb. And Stalin knew that, this was being kept secret from him. So it increased his distrust of the United States and England. He felt like, his two major allies were sort of ganging up against him and his country. I also kind of wanted y'all to look at the map. Well, not the map, sorry, the graph of casualties, World War II casualties that I posted in last week's content. You can see from that graph that the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people in World War II, which is incredible. The United States lost a lot less than that. So, and also the Soviet Union was just was physically destroyed. There was a lot of war, a lot of battles happening on Soviet territory. That did not happen in the United States. Yes, Pearl Harbor was bombed. The military base was bombed. It did not destroy the city, and Hawaii was not yet a U.S. state, so it wasn't really part of America. Technically, it was territory, but not where we considered like Americans to live at that point in time. So the United States was not bombed at all on the mainland, and the Soviet Union was heavily bombed with a lot of casualties. So coming out of World War II, the U.S. was in a really good place. We were the only country that had atomic weapons, and so therefore that made us the undisputed leader of the world. That would last until 1949 when the Soviets developed their own atomic weapons. But for a number of years, it was pretty clear that we had the complete upper hand because of those atomic weapons. Our economy was also thriving. World War II was great for our economy. It led to the biggest economic boom in human history. Soviets, on the other hand, were suffering. A lot of Europe was suffering after World War II because of the destruction that took place on their territory. So there were also differences, like just fundamental differences between the United States political and economic system versus the Soviet Union's. So the thing that's interesting is that both our system, capitalism, and the Soviet system, communism, both of those needed to spread. So for the US, capitalism, we relied on the spread of capitalism because we relied on international markets and international supplies of vital resources. So if more and more countries turn to communism, that would be a threat to our economic security. We had, gone to war to gain access to consumers and vital raw materials in other parts of the world, colonies. And if countries around the world more and more started turning to communism, that would disrupt our global economic system that we were a very important part of. So that was one reason we really needed capitalism to spread. The Soviets, on the other hand, needed communism to spread. On this next graph right here, if you pull up the map, you can see why. Because the Soviet Union had been attacked by Germany twice in the 20th century, and they had been, nearly demolished by Germany. So coming out of World War II, their main concern was to have what they called buffer states between them and Germany. They wanted countries to sort of form a barrier, protection from Germany. So you can see all these small countries here to the west of the Soviet Union: Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania. The Soviet Union insisted that those become communist nations that were under their control, their buffer states, their satellite states. So nation states that they actually had power over in order to protect themselves from Germany. So the United States viewed this as them spreading communism throughout Europe, whereas the Soviet Union viewed it as their right to protect themselves from Germany. So you can see this sort of fundamental kind of conflict. Also, one of the reasons, one of the elements that led to greater conflict was that the premier of Russia, Stalin, had promised that he would allow the people in these countries, Poland, Romania, and the like, to have free elections and elect their own government and choose whether or not they wanted, a communist government. He did not follow through on those promises and kind of forced those countries into the domain of the Soviet Union. They became part of the Soviet Union. So in the United States, this was seen as them extending their totalitarian rule across Europe. There's a couple of key ideas and terms that we have to be aware of when we discuss communism. The only one I'm going to mention here is containment. Containment became the overriding foreign policy philosophy of the United States throughout the Cold War. It's really important to understand this term. What it meant was that we would not let communism spread. We would let it exist where it currently existed, but we cannot allow it to spread. When we get to the Vietnam War in a couple of weeks, keep this in mind, because this is really the cause of the Vietnam War, that communism was starting to spread in Asia. It was also the cause of the Korean War. But just know this our foreign policy for 46 years was based on this idea of containment. Make sure you read over the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in the textbook. Those were very important US foreign policies, and I'm not going to explain the actual plan, but I do want to explain the philosophy for these plans. The philosophy for helping build up the economies of other countries is based on lessons learned from the Great Depression and World War II. And that lesson was that when countries are economically devastated, they become a threat to us. We saw this happen with Germany. We saw this happen with Japan, and even the Soviet Union. Countries don't turn to fascism or communism when the economy is doing well. They turn to those extreme forms of government when they're desperate, and when they do turn to fascism or communism, it becomes a threat to us. So there was sort of this widespread understanding that if we want peace in the United States, we have to spread prosperity throughout the world. And as we spread this prosperity, it actually helped our economy by helping the economies of European nations, especially Greece and Turkey, because of their access to Middle Eastern oil. By helping their economies, it helped us greatly because they were trading partners. They were consumers of American products, and they couldn't be consumers if they didn't have money or if they were communists. So these things ended up benefiting the United States, but they were also just sort of policies for spreading prosperity throughout much of Europe. The Berlin Airlift was another important event, and there is actually a short video that you'll need to watch about it. So make sure you watch that. But the one thing I want to point out here is when you look at the map of Germany, in case it's a bit confusing, I will explain that after Germany surrendered in World War II, the country was divided into 4 different sectors, and each allied nation had their own sector. So the Soviet Union is in red. The United States, our sector is in yellow on this map. France is the blue and England is the green. So this was sort of a way of dividing up Germany. And if y'all will recall, when we talked about the use of atomic bombs in Japan, part of the reason for the United States using atomic bombs was to keep the Soviet Union out of the war against Japan. They had promised that they would help us defeat Japan by August 9th, August 8th. And we wanted to prevent that from happening because we wanted to be able to control Japan by ourselves without the Soviet Union saying, hey, we helped defeat Japan, so we should have a stake in occupying Japan, and we should have a stake in sort of rebuilding the Japanese government and economy. The United States did not want that. Our government wanted us to be in charge in Japan. And when you see the map of Germany, you can kind of understand that sentiment, because all 4 of these allied countries kind of had to divide Germany up. Because all 4 were involved in defeating Germany. The problem with the way they divided Germany was that the most important city, the capital city, Berlin, was very much in the east, or in the Soviet sector of Germany, as you can see from this map. And so the 4 allied countries actually split up the city of Berlin, the capital city. So even in the city, you can see these 4 different colors that correspond to each allied country. This was all fine until around 1948, when the United States, France, and England decided, like, hey, we want to help Germany rebuild. We want to help Germany become prosperous, because that'll actually benefit us economically, and it'll also make sure that, you know, Germany doesn't elect another guy like Hitler if they're prosperous. So the Soviet Union did not agree with this at all. They said, we want to keep Germany weak. Germany continues to be a threat to us. They're aggressive towards us. We are the closest to Germany. We want them to stay weak. So England, France, and the United States all sort of combined their sections of Germany and made the country of West Germany. However, Berlin was still in the Soviet sector. And please watch the video on the Berlin Airlift for more information on that. I just wanted to give you a background. Moving on to the 1948 presidential election. First, just let me remind you that Roosevelt died in April of 1945. At that point in time, Harry Truman took over as president. He was the one who made the decision to drop the bombs on Japan. And when the 1948 presidential election came around, he was running for president for the first time. In this presidential election, a couple of important things happened. For one, President Truman came out and surprised everybody. Remember, he was a Democrat. The Democratic Party was the party of the South. Even though FDR and the New Deal really helped to begin to change that, those things don't change immediately. So there was still this association of the Democratic Party with racism. And pretty much all Southerners were Democrats. The Democratic Party had expanded to the North, but the South was still the solid South. So at the Democratic presidential convention, sorry, um, Harry Truman came out and said, "Hey, like you should, my party should nominate me for the Democratic nominee," and he surprised everyone by endorsing civil rights legislation. People were very surprised because he was a Democrat. This was not the party of um, civil rights for African Americans. But Truman felt strongly about it. Remember, he was Roosevelt's vice president, and he actually had kind of instigated a study of racial violence and racism in the South. He was from Missouri, so he really wasn't too familiar with what was happening in the Deep South, and he sent out a commission to do an investigation of racism in the South. And when they came back to him with their findings, he was horrified, like genuinely horrified. So in 1948, he proposes all this civil rights legislation, and people in that convention, about half of them were angry. They were not having that. And they got up and left. They walked out of the convention. Soon they started their own party, their own political party. It was called the States' Rights Party. The common name was the Dixiecrat Party, and it was headed by Strom Thurmond, and they nominated Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate. So this is important because it kind of furthers along the changing of the Democratic Party to have a presidential nominee come out and support civil rights legislation. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Truman for doing that. There were two other candidates, and mostly these two candidates disagreed on how tough they wanted to be against communism. The Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey, was taking a real strong stand against communism and against the Soviet Union. The Progressive Party candidate, Henry Wallace, was a New Dealer. He had been part of the New Deal with FDR. And what made him important was that he was really seriously proposing nationalized health insurance, which is something that we still struggle with today. He also was not, he didn't want to continue this hard line dealing with the Soviet Union. He wanted to sort of stop this like extreme Cold War atmosphere. The election was so close that newspapers actually printed headlines that said Dewey defeats Truman. Thomas Dewey defeats Truman. And you can see you can see pictures of those newspaper headlines, and you can see Truman holding up that paper. And that was wrong. When the final numbers of votes came in, Truman had won by a very, very slim margin, but Truman did win the 1948 presidential election. So make sure you read about NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And I always sort of explain this like it became kind of like two teams. The Soviet Union had their team, which was the Warsaw Pact, and they were the head of that team. And the other team was NATO, which was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the United States was one of the heads of that team, probably the head, but there were also other important members like England and France and much of West Germany. So basically, these two different teams kind of divided the world. Much of the world had to choose a side. And this is where it kind of began to involve other parts of the world and smaller countries. A lot of smaller countries were sort of forced or very much encouraged to kind of choose a side. And if you choose a side, you kind of have protection because you're a member of NATO. So NATO was an alliance of nations against communism. So if you were a member of NATO, you kind of had the backing of the United States to protect you. And same with the Warsaw Pact, which was started in 1955. So a lot of countries really felt pressure to choose one or the other. And I wanted to explain what the terms first world, second world, and third world meant at the time. First world countries referred to capitalist nations like the United States and our allies. The second world referred to communist nations, the Soviet Union and their allies. And the third world referred to nations that had not chosen a side, unaligned nations. So now the definition of third world is a little different. Now we kind of see it as like developing country or poor country is a third world country. But at the time, third world meant that you were not aligned with either one of these teams. And both teams, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, worked really hard to get third world countries to join their team. It almost reminds me of like um, kids playing a team game and they're like the team captains picking people to join their team. The team captains wanted these third world countries to join their teams, and they went to great lengths to make sure that that happens. Um, I am going to skip the next slide, except for mentioning that the Soviet Union successfully tested their first atomic weapon in 1949. And this changed the balance of power in the world. Prior to this, the United States was the only country that has atomic weapons. So once the Soviet Union developed their own atomic weapons, now there were two sides. There were two equally balanced enemies. And the US's economy was much stronger than the Soviet Union's, but none of that matters if the Soviets had atomic bombs. That leveled the playing field. Nothing else matters if you have an atomic bomb. So after 1949, it was basically like an even match between us and the Soviet Union, because either country could obliterate the other within a matter of minutes if they chose. Also in this year, China had a communist revolution and became a communist country and established an alliance with the Soviet Union. And that scared the United States even more. People here were like, okay, first of all, the Soviets have an atomic bomb. Secondly, China, the biggest country in the world, the most populous country in the world, has joined together with the Soviet Union. This was a threat to containment because communism was spreading, and it was spreading in Asia. This is kind of the basis of the Korean War. And this is a huge topic that I'm not going to talk for 30 minutes about it, but make sure you guys read about the Korean War and just know that the Korean War was a Cold War war. It was fought between the United States, between the United Nations, really, and the Soviet Union. And so what happened was Korea, after World War II, was divided into, just like Vietnam, the North was kind of dominated by the Soviet Union and it was communist, and the South was dominated by the United States and it was capitalist. At some point in the late 1940s, the United States felt like, why do we still have troops in South Korea? Why? It's not that important to us. Let's withdraw those troops and put them somewhere that is more important to our national security. So American troops were withdrawn, and pretty much immediately, South Korea was attacked by North Korea, and it became a communist country. They were trying to unite both parts of Korea under a communist government. So when that happened, the United Nations decided, they have to step in and prevent South Korea from being overtaken by communism. The United States never declared war in the Korean War. This is something that we'll also see in the Vietnam War. There was no declaration of war. Congress never voted on war. And our Constitution requires that in order for the president to send troops overseas, Congress has to vote, and it has to be a 2/3 majority. In order to get around that, this was not called a war. It was called a United Nations police action. So this allowed the United Nations to send troops to fight in Korea, but the vast majority of those troops were American troops. So basically American troops were being sent overseas without congressional approval. And just remember that, because we'll see the same thing in Vietnam. The Korean War went on for 2 years, and it was a very deadly war and, awful on both sides. And during the war, when we weren't doing so great, people were like, why don't we use the atomic bomb? We have the atomic bomb. And I want to ask y'all, why didn't we use it? And I'm going to give you a minute to answer, and I'm going to pretend that someone said, because the Soviets had one too. That's the answer. We can't use an atomic weapon if our enemy has one too, unless we want to die. So there was a song from the 1980s by Sting, and it's called Russians, and he keeps saying, I hope the Russians love their children too. And what that meant was, we can't use our atomic bombs if we don't want our children to die. because our enemy will retaliate and use them against us. And so this kind of kept both the United States and the Soviet Union in check. In a way, it was probably beneficial that both sides had access to atomic weapons because neither side was willing to cross the line to go that far because they knew what would happen if they did. So this policy has a great name, MAD, and what that meant was mutually assured destruction. It actually fits very well, MAD. But the outcome of the Korean War was basically a stalemate. The UN agreed to a ceasefire, and the division between North and South Korea was put back in place with communism in the North and capitalism in the South. And that dividing line was almost exactly where it had been before. So basically, the war was a draw, it was a stalemate, and nothing changed as a result of it except for about 5 million deaths. The vast majority of the deaths were Koreans. So the impacts of the Korean War were like a big disappointment to the United States. People were sort of like, how could we not win this war? We just won World War II. And it was sort of like this wake up call where people were like, maybe we're not the strongest nation in the world. And now communism is spreading in China. So it kind of increased fear in the United States about, our place in the world. It led to a permanent increase in defense spending. So defense spending went from 13.5 billion to 50 billion during the war. And this really kind of strengthened the idea of the military industrial complex, which I'm going to explain this idea. So remember when we talked about the Great Depression and we said what ended the Great Depression was war, World War II. Even before we officially joined the war, our economy was getting out of the depression because we were producing for the war effort. We were selling supplies and loaning supplies to France and England. That helped us start to get out of the depression. When we joined the war, our economy boomed very quickly. And so this is the basis of the military industrial complex. And that means that our economy relies on war. Wartime production is vital for our economy to be strong. And this happened, this is a very scary idea. And the president, after Truman, Eisenhower, he actually in his farewell address warned America of this. He said, our economy has become dependent on war, and this is not good. We always need a war. That's not a good thing. So the Korean War just kind of exacerbated that idea. It was good for the American economy, but it resulted in about 5 million deaths. So the entire basis of the Cold War kind of relates to the military industrial complex as well. Towards the end of World War II, there was this great fear that we are going to go back into a depression. After the war ends, we're going to go back into a depression because the only thing that ended the depression was the war. So there were two things that were done to prevent that depression. One was mass consumerism, which we'll talk about next week. The second was keeping us in a state of war. So the Cold War, we had to be in a state of war to keep up military spending, to justify military spending. So for many people who are pretty cynical, this is why the Cold War happened for in some ways. I'm not going to say it's the whole entire explanation of the Cold War, but in some ways we needed a war and we needed an enemy, and the Soviet Union provided that. Another impact of the Korean War was that the draft became a regular feature of American life. It stayed in effect for the next 20 years, and peacetime military duty stayed active around the world. So it kind of led to this buildup of not only war production, but also in military spending, but also the military in general, more people being drafted and being sent to serve in different countries. Korean War also gave more power to the president. I mean, President Truman and then Eisenhower, Truman and Eisenhower both were involved in sending troops to fight overseas without congressional approval, which is a big no-no. So fear of atomic war hit the United States hard. And please read the textbook about this. There's so many ways in which this fear began to dominate American life and American culture. And y'all probably most of us know where a fallout shelter is. A house I used to live in Nashville has a fallout shelter. A lot of people built those because of fear of atomic war. So they built these like underground shelters they could go in, which are good now because we can use them for tornadoes, but that wasn't the original purpose. Oh, the second Red Scare in the United States was much worse than the one that followed World War I. There was a guy named Joseph McCarthy, and he became kind of the face of this Red Scare, which was the fear of communism. And so sometimes people call the second Red Scare, they'll just call it McCarthyism. It was this witch hunt in the United States, a witch hunt of people who were suspected communists. And I just wanted to remind y'all that in the 1930s, there were a lot of communists in America. It was the Great Depression. Communism was not this evil thing in the 1930s. A lot of people were starting to think that maybe we need this here. So it's been called the heyday of American communism. So many people by the late 1940s had been communists in the 1930s, or maybe they attended a communist meeting or subscribed to a communist newspaper or something in the 1930s. And that was fairly common among people in the late 40s. However, in the late 40s, that was enough to make you a suspect. It was enough to make you potentially lose your job and your reputation if you had been involved with communism in your past. So there was this massive paranoia that there's communists everywhere and they're trying to infiltrate our government. They're trying to infiltrate Hollywood so that they can make movies with communist messages. They're trying to infiltrate our educational system. So teachers will try to brainwash students to believing that communism is the best form of government. So people, our government became increasingly paranoid, and they kind of went on this quest to root out potential communists throughout the country. There were different programs that were established to find communists, and they were looking for communists, fascists, and anyone guilty of, quote, sympathetic association, meaning that even if you weren't a communist, if you were friends with one, that could be enough to vindicate you. A lot of political and social organizations were outlawed, and a lot of these were just like civil rights groups. Anything that could be seen as having any taint of communism would be suspect to be outlawed. So a lot of civil rights groups were not, actively pushing for communism, but they were pushing for equality. And equality is one of the basic ideas of communism. Communism is based on this idea that everyone's equal. So civil rights groups could be accused of teaching communism and spreading communism, which is crazy. But this happened a lot. The Internal Security Act was passed in 1950, and that authorized the Attorney General to arrest suspect persons during a national emergency. And suspect persons could be people who just wanted like equality for African Americans. This act also barred people who were deemed subversive or homosexual from becoming American citizens or even from visiting the United States. And this is another thing that's just insane. There was a lot of fear of gay people, especially gay men, during the Cold War. And, gay people were banned from visiting the United States, or if they were immigrants, they couldn't become citizens. And I've often, thought that that's so bizarre. And the only justification, it's not justified at all. But the only explanation for it comes from a couple of documents where certain government officials said something like, homosexuals are a threat to our national security because they could easily be blackmailed by enemy agents. So they just thought that gay people would, so easily succumb to communist blackmail, which is so bizarre. But Truman actually tried to veto both the Executive Order of 9835 and the Internal Security Act. He tried to veto those, but Congress overrode his veto both times because of this widespread fear of communism. People were, whenever news came out that the Soviets had tested their first atomic weapon, people here in the United States immediately came to the conclusion that there must have been a spy in the Manhattan Project, and there was. So before they, had that verified, this fear that there must have been a spy made everyone more paranoid and made people think like, gosh, there's spies everywhere, and there was one on this project, and now the Soviet Union has this bomb that could kill us any second. So we need to, find out where these spies are. We need to punish them. With regards to the Manhattan Project, there was a spy, and a spy who worked on the Manhattan Project, and his brother-in-law was named Julius Rosenberg. His sister, Julius's wife, was Ethel Rosenberg. And after several years of investigating, it was found that the spy on the Manhattan Project had given Julius Rosenberg information, like very top secret information about the physics behind the atomic bomb. And Julius Rosenberg had passed that on to Soviet officials. For a long time, people thought that they weren't guilty, and new information has come out in the past, I don't know, maybe 15 years that indicate that Julius Rosenberg was guilty. He was involved in that. However, his wife Ethel had nothing to do with it. She didn't know about it. But both of them were executed in 1953. There were a couple of other very high profile spy cases in the United States that really fueled this fire, this paranoia. Fear and suspicion intensified greatly. People began to wonder who their neighbors were. Like who is this person that's who is our mayor? Is he a communist? Like people became really paranoid, and they just kind of didn't trust other people. You can kind of see this when you look at a lot of horror movies from the 1950s. They're kind of based on this idea of like things aren't what they seem. There's a lot of a lot of fear of aliens expressed in the movies, and there's also like zombies. So people kind of express that fear through a lot of horror movies. And actually, I'm going to offer an extra credit option right here for those of you who are watching. This is what you get for watching. Anyone who wants to do an extra credit option, do a little bit of research on horror movies during the Cold War, particularly the earlier decades of the Cold War, like the 50s and 60s, and mention how those Cold War fears influenced horror movies. And you can look at one horror movie in particular, or you can look at kind of horror movies generally. And that's a really interesting topic. So feel free to do some research, write one page about it, submit it before the end of you can have some time. You can have about 3 weeks to do this. There's no hard deadline, and I'll give you some extra credit on one of your quiz grades. So moving on, looking at Hollywood, I kind of mentioned already why Hollywood was a target of the communist witch hunt. But the House Un-American Activities Commission, which was the organization that was supposed to find communists, they really began to target Hollywood, primarily because of Hollywood's potential to influence people. They could put subversive communist messages in movies. Hollywood had done a lot of propaganda-ing during World War II. They made a lot of films and a lot of movies to help generate support for the war. So people kind of recognize that Hollywood has a lot of potential for propaganda and for shaping public opinion. So after the war, they became concerned that there were a lot of liberals in Hollywood, and what kind of messages are they putting in movies. Also, Hollywood was dominated by Jewish people, and Jewish people were often associated with liberal causes and with communism. So a lot of conservatives targeted Hollywood as like a bastion of liberal tendencies. So there was sort of this witch hunt of Hollywood, where like movie producers, directors, executives, owners of different production companies, and actors and screenplay writers were questioned. They were publicly questioned in these hearings, and many of those were televised. And they would ask them, like, are you a communist? Have you ever been a communist? Do you know anyone who is a communist? And basically, if people said, no, I'm not a communist, no, I've never been a communist, and then they would say, can you tell us someone who is a communist? If you wanted to clear your name quickly and you wanted to not be a suspect at all, you would give them a name. You would say, I'm not a communist, but so and so who works on this, who worked with me on this set, talked about how he supported equality for all people, and maybe communism was not such a bad idea. And so they would say, oh, okay, well, we're going to go find that person and question him. But the fact that you gave us that information proves that you are not a communist, because you are helping us to fight communism. So your name is clear. And so this is why it's been called a witch hunt, because the way you could clear your name and clear any suspicion of you was to infiltrate, there's a word I'm looking for, was to make someone else a suspect, was to say, no, that you should look at this person. They're the communists. And so it became this witch hunt where people were going up on trial and they were naming names. And so you still hear that sometimes. People say, like, they named names, that meant this is what they were talking about. There was a screenplay writer named Arthur Miller, and he wrote a play, or a book, called The Crucible. Actually, it was a play first. And some of you may have read this, or you may know what I'm talking about. But The Crucible is about the Salem witch trials in like the 1600s in Salem, Massachusetts. And he wrote this book that was about the Salem witch trials, and it's the same idea of the witch hunt, that people, like the witches, the accused witches, were trying to clear their name by saying, this person's a witch. So that was the same thing that was happening in Hollywood. But Arthur Miller was making a analogy. He was trying to say, like, this is a witch hunt, but he knew that if he wrote a play about the Red Scare of the late 1940s, that he would be arrested, because he would be considered a communist, because he's criticizing the witch hunt. So he couldn't write his play about the witch hunt. He wrote it about he couldn't write his play about the communist witch hunts. So he wrote it about the Salem witch trials as a metaphor. So people didn't actually know that he was talking about the Red Scare, but he actually was. So if you've seen that, it's a movie now. If you've seen that movie, think back to it and kind of put it in the context that he was actually referring to McCarthyism and the Red Scare. The Red Scare got out of control. People were afraid to speak up against it. They were afraid to speak up against Joseph McCarthy, and they were afraid to say, like, this communist witch hunt is insane. They were afraid to say that, because if they said that, they would be suspected communists. One of the only people in power who could say that without repercussion was Eleanor Roosevelt. By then, she was very well respected. She had been the first lady for over 3 terms, not fully 4, over 3 terms. She was the United States delegation to the United Nations, or the United States ambassador to the UN's delegation on the first human rights committee, where they were going to draft the human rights kind of constitution. And this was a big deal. And Eleanor Roosevelt was chosen to represent the United States. And she was kind of above all this. And so she felt like she could criticize this hysteria without herself being targeted as a suspected communist. And so she did that. She criticized it. Others were scared to. When we were looking at the PowerPoint from last week I'm moving on to the next slide. We were looking at the PowerPoint about science and technology. And this sort of effect of World War II was that national security became reliant on science and technology. After all, that's what developed the atomic bomb. So after World War II, there was sort of this obsession with increasing our science and technology education and output. So NASA was established. More colleges and universities were given massive government grants for research, scientific research, when it came primarily to national security. And a lot of that had to do with space research. So in October of 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite into space. And that really freaked Americans out. There was a sense that, like, wow, they're beating us at science, they're beating us at technology, they're going to have control of space, which means that we are doomed, not only economically, but like national security is being threatened because they are indicating that they have superior technology. So there was more and more of a push for the United States to catch up with space technology and defense technology. And because of this, the priorities of military spending shifted to technology research. The priorities of having a lot of men and women like serving in the armed forces, that shifted. We felt like we don't need all these people to fight anymore. We just need superior weapons. So instead of building up troops, we began to stockpile weapons. And it led to this arms race where both the United States and the Soviet Union were stockpiling weapons. Trying to get more weapons than the other side. And because of reconnaissance missions and spies, both sides were able to sort of tally what the other side had in their possession. And they were both trying to like outdo the other side with having more and more weapons. All right, so I did put a final slide here, legacies of the Cold War, but just kind of keep in mind that we did not cover most of the Cold War. The Cold War actually goes on for many decades. But in the future chapters, most of what we'll be looking at in terms of American domestic and foreign policy was based on the Cold War. So the Vietnam War was part of the Cold War. So we will get back to the Cold War. But just for now, take a look at the legacies of the Cold War that I've listed here, and just make sure that you're familiar with how the Cold War continued to shape American culture, politics, and economic growth, and science and technology. Next week we will look more in depth at American culture in the 1950s. All right, you guys, thank you for listening. And I'm getting back to where I can stop this. Have a great day.